Hello, and welcome to Tax and Tech, a Deloitte podcast focused on helping you navigate the ever-changing tax technology landscape through insightful conversations with Deloitte technology leaders. I'm your host, Emily VanVleet, a partner in our tax management consulting practice here at Deloitte. I'm so glad that you can join us for this episode, and I am very excited to be talking today with Scott Shafer, who is also a partner in our practice here at Deloitte and is our SAP practice leader for tax. So Scott, welcome to our episode.
Thank you, Emily. Happy to be here.
Excellent. So before we dive in, let me just make a couple of housekeeping notes for our listeners. I'd encourage you to please subscribe to our On Tax Tech webcast wherever you listen to this podcast so that you don't miss out on any of our episodes. We have other episodes covering topics like different financial systems such as Oracle. We have episodes on tax in a digital world, some tax technology updates related to tax reform, and many other timely topics. And then to find more of Deloitte's tax technology thought leadership in these areas, you can also check out Deloitte.com under Tax Management Consulting. So with that out of the way, Scott, let's go ahead and dive in to our conversation here with you. And so as our SAP practice leader for tax, I know you are doing a lot of consulting with our clients around migrations that are either underway or in some cases are kind of just in the planning stages, but migrations to that next generation of ERP technology. And so before we really dive into anything specific to SAP, why don't you just share with our listeners your thoughts or your perspective around these next generation ERP platforms and kind of what does this mean for tax, or why should tax departments really be interested in and looking forward to these migrations?
Sure, happy to. I mean, to me, there's never been a more exciting time for tax to get integrated into these new ERP migrations. And with respect to SAP, we're almost in a perfect storm situation for tax because we've got a whole SAP customer base that's needing to migrate to S/4HANA, either on-prem or cloud by 2025. I mean, SAP has stated a 2025 date for when they want customers to migrate over. They're going to stop supporting some of the earlier versions of SAP after that. So it's created this impetus for companies to really move forward. So you have that as one item. Then the second item that's kind of happening at the same time, as we as tax people know, is with tax reform in the U.S. and other global regulatory changes happening around the world, it's created a really perfect time for tax to get very integrated into these migrations. And for once, and I would say finally, get all the data that's needed for some of the complex regulations as part of tax reform and some of the other reporting requirements globally.
Right. Yeah. And if we just stay for a minute, Scott, on that topic of global regulatory change, I know many of those changes that are coming through are very different in that they are at times requiring real-time reporting, right? At times and in certain jurisdictions requiring a direct connection into the company's systems. And so I do think that is really driving tax departments to think about how they can possibly keep up with that, right? Because we're not going to be able to really do all of the data cleanup on the back end of financial processes that many tax departments have kind of gotten used to just having to do on their own.
Yeah, exactly. That's absolutely right. And with the new generation of SAP, it becomes entirely possible for companies to actually adhere to the real-time reporting requirements. It's very data intensive, as you mentioned, as transactions are being posted. In some instances, that you'll have an automatic transmission to the government regulatory agency, and so and that's just a really important piece. Is I think I call it like kind of in the area of efficiency and just actually adhering to the reporting requirements. But what I also want to bring up is that there's that piece, and that's all great from a reporting perspective, but it's also the opportunity for tax to really establish more of a value proposition. And so, as I mentioned before, with U.S. tax reform in particular, where companies are actually looking at what their supply chain looks like, do they need to change it based on tax reform? What's their company structure look like? And so all these are major components of core ERP setup. And so there's a real opportunity for companies to not only get their reporting and compliance right, but also generate additional cash tax savings, mitigate their risk exposures and things like that as well.
Okay, so I may come back here a bit later and ask you for some more specifics around SAP, but that concept of kind of driving value and potentially contributing to a business case for the migration, that really is a key point, right? So why don't we explore that a little bit more? Can you share any examples or share some of the major kind of business case considerations that tax professionals should be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned a couple of them. I think as companies are looking at what they need to look like in this post-tax reform environment, some of the kind of critical decisions that are made early on in an SAP implementation are what's the company structure look like in the ERP. And so you can see, like, if you're changing your structure, you're changing your supply chain, how your intercompany transactions work, those are all critical, not only decisions, but huge opportunities for tax. Not only will, as I mentioned before, possibly get into situations where you generate additional cash tax savings, but also have a much more streamlined transfer pricing process, for example. Some of the areas that we see oftentimes are, in addition to supply chain and company restructuring, are just R&D credits, getting better data, getting the system set up to get better credit information, tax sensitizing the chart of accounts, and actually being able to get more granular in your book tax differences. And then really, whatever is kind of industry specific or company specific, really honing in on, what are the handful of items, not trying to boil the ocean, but what are the 4 or 5 things, big ticket items that companies are really looking at from a planning perspective. And typically we find that the data is somewhat difficult to get, or it's well past when transactions took place. And so actually helping them get on top of it in a more real-time or near real-time manner to do more effective tax planning and forecasting is a huge component of the business case as well. So we typically see in terms of the tax value case, kind of falling into three main buckets. One is, of course, cash tax savings. The second one is mitigating risks and exposures. And then the third are efficiency gains.
Okay, great. Yeah, and sometimes, you've mentioned potentially some planning that could be enabled, potentially some structure changes that you may need to consider. What I've seen happen many times, right, is that this sort of change in the ERP or in the financial systems can mean that something the tax department has considered in the past but couldn't really handle from a data standpoint can now be built into the implementation or the migration, and then it's sustainable, right? And so it can even reopen some doors that maybe a tax team has considered in the past but didn't really feel like they were well positioned to tackle at that time.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, in speaking with, in this world that we're in now of companies migrating to SAP S/4HANA, talking to a lot of tax folks and finance people outside of tax at our clients. And I think that tax was really omitted, left out to a large degree on the last go around of SAP implementations. So I mentioned that in talking with both tax and finance people at our clients that people readily admit that tax was largely not addressed in prior implementations of SAP, earlier versions and so forth. And I think there's an appetite for it. And I think as we layer in some of the tax value proposition components, as I discussed, then it really raises the visibility of tax. Tax becomes a real critical part of a company's overall business case. And we've seen that typically be, one of the top components of a business case, if not the top component of a business case, is just the tax value. So we really think it's a perfect time. And again, when you have 2 things converging, like a major SAP upgrade with our lives in tax in a post-tax reform environment, it really is the perfect time and the perfect opportunity for tax to really get involved early on.
Yeah. So the way I hear you describing it, Scott, it's almost like tax can have a carrot and a stick, right? We can have the carrot of the value case, and we really can contribute real and meaningful value to the business case and how the implementation is funded, if you will. But then we also have the stick we talked about earlier of the regulatory environment changing, and really it no longer being an option necessarily to leave tax out of the equation.
Exactly. That's absolutely right. I think in the past, tax has kind of been mostly a stick. And whether or not they had a compelling reason, I mean, I think the burden fell on tax, and tax, got the job done. It might not have been the most efficient thing in the world, but they got it done. But now is the opportunity to really get it automated and really have one version of the truth, single source of data. Again, it's just the perfect time for tax to get integrated in SAP.
Okay, perfect. Well, that's a great conversation. I'm sure is very helpful for our listeners here. Why don't we shift gears just a little bit, because I mentioned you are our SAP leader for tax. And so, many tax professionals who are listening, they might have heard S/4HANA kind of, batted around in water cooler conversation or what have you, but they may not know a whole lot about what that platform actually means. So could you just share what you consider to be some of the high points or the highlights that the tax professionals might be interested in around what is S/4HANA? What should they know about it?
Yeah, there's a few things. I think what's exciting is I think in the past there's been, somewhat limited ability to get some of the information we need for tax built in. As we all know as tax people, we need very detailed data. We often need jurisdictional information, so we need to have data by location, and it's been at times somewhat difficult to get everything we need. And there's just new functionality in S/4HANA, not the least of which is this universal journal concept, which really provides a lot more flexibility, a lot more fields, if you will, for which to kind of tag tax data. So it actually becomes much easier for tax to get some of the things they need. There are also many companies that have very disparate underlying ERP systems, because as we all know, most companies are not on a single ERP. Some are lucky enough, but most aren't. And what we're seeing now too is what's called central finance in SAP, and companies that are very decentralized and have disparate systems, kind of taking an approach that they would implement central finance first. So think of it as a way of kind of having a central repository for all your financial data that would have mappings from all the underlying ERPs. But then you actually get all your finance data into one place. It becomes a nice roadmap, because from there, then companies can then go on the journey of actually migrating all the underlying localized systems into S/4HANA. But there's opportunity for tax to get involved in central finance as well, because as I said, it kind of sits on top of all the systems. And so it provides a nice way to quickly get tax integrated and centralized, on a company's overall S4 journey.
Great. So be on the lookout for Universal Journal conversations around your implementation, and also central finance. And so central finance really sounds like that could be exciting, right? Because I think sometimes there could be a tendency to think that we will kind of push tax requirements toward the back end of an implementation. And so for a company that's starting with central finance, that can really provide some value for a tax team much, much earlier in that implementation journey.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that brings up another good point. I can't stress enough. I mean, I've had so many clients over the years that for whatever reason, tax didn't make like the first wave of the SAP implementation. And they, it was just like you said, like, oh, we'll get to tax, in the next wave. That's not an acceptable answer, because as I mentioned before, some just setting up company codes and some of the basic master data requirements and things like that, some of the decisions that are made very early on in companies, those happen very early, and so tax needs to be involved from the very beginning. It's never too early for tax to get involved, and it's just not an acceptable answer that tax will be addressed in a subsequent phase.
Okay, so for a tax department or a tax professional that really does want to be proactive and jump on some of these opportunities that S/4HANA is going to provide, where would you suggest they start?
We always recommend that companies start by looking at all their data requirements. So you almost need to do a bottoms-up approach, and we would typically recommend a client look at all the detailed data they need for all their book tax differences, for what they need for tax planning, for tax provision, for indirect tax, all those things. And it can be a very tedious process, but the only way to really get everything you need and really get the detailed data requirements built in the system is to go to that level. So that's usually what we have companies do, and we've oftentimes have seen clients really getting ahead of these journeys and finding out from their IT departments or through finance, what the roadmap is going to be for S/4HANA and the overall migration, and then figure out how do you calendarize what you need to do for tax to meet those broad milestone dates. And again, it's much easier if tax gets ahead of the game themselves and has a real exclusive, exhaustive list of their data requirements. And then the other thing I would point out is that usually the programs are set up around major business processes like order to cash, procure to pay, record to report, et cetera. And as we all know as tax people, we've got requirements in all those underlying processes. And so to the extent we have the detailed data kind of already identified, then we can kind of match up, well, which overall business process does each data requirement go in? Because I've seen the most successful tax departments are when they are able to really get their tax requirements built into underlying processes rather than just having a standalone tax requirements. As we all know, tax doesn't really generate its own data. We're like the largest reuser of data. We rely on others to get the data we need. And so if we're able to actually get that integrated into the underlying processes, it just becomes easier for the tax requirements to actually get addressed.
Okay, great. So a couple key takeaways that I'm hearing. One is to find out what the roadmap looks like, right? And be proactive about how you as a tax team are going to get ready for that roadmap and then plug in when you need to. And then you're also describing getting started early on those data requirements. And I have seen that really make a difference between a tax team kind of sitting in on a record to report workshop, right? And just kind of listening in, learning about what's going on versus really being able to walk in with a set of data requirements that are targeted to the topic of that working session and really play a key role as a contributor to how that module needs to be addressed.
Yeah, exactly. And so you're not really recreating the wheel for anything. You might be just tweaking an underlying process or asking for a couple of pieces of information more than they would have otherwise. But it just becomes more easy to address the tax requirements when we do it that way.
Okay, great. Well, Scott, I think that we can probably leave it there for today. I thank you so much for taking time out of your day to chat with me and just share with our listeners, maybe provide some clarity, certainly around SAP and what's coming with S/4HANA. But also, I feel like we had a really robust and well-rounded conversation just around ERP for tax and some things to consider and potentially get started on. So thank you very much. And finally, I would encourage you to subscribe to our Tax and Tech podcast series wherever you are listening in today so that you don't miss any of our episodes. We have episodes coming up around cloud ERP systems, tax technology updates related to U.S. tax reform, and many other timely topics connected to tax technology. So a big thank you to everyone listening in. I hope you will join us again as we continue to chart the tax department's digital future on another episode of Tax and Tech. Thanks very much.